St. Mark's Cathedral acknowledges that we gather on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, who are still here. And we honor with gratitude the land itself and the life of all the Coast Salish tribes. So let us open in prayer. God be with you. Holy God, we give you thanks for we are wonderfully made. We give you thanks for our senses, for our embodiment, for the way we know each other through our bodies. Be with us tonight as we explore emotions and embodiment and lead us in the way that is freedom and peace. Amen. So when we have longer sharings, I'll pass around the microphone. And for you on Zoom, for just this very first part, when people popcorn words, I'll repeat them. But what I'd like you to do first is, what comes up for you when you hear the words grief and joy? Suffering. Death and birth. Waves. Loss. Intensity. So Emily's remembering a little 3-year-old, I think, running around tonight in her beautiful pink skirt that floats, and she knows how to jump just so it floats the best way. And it was fabulous to watch. Joy. Steve, are there those online? Elizabeth.
Oh, just so much.
So much.
It has to be so large to hold both grief and joy.
Yeah.
We have to be so large.
We have to be so large to hold both grief and joy. Anybody else on Zoom? Yeah.
Life.
Life. Indeed.
That's what I was going to.
Anybody else? Presence? Does it feel odd for you to see them together and to claim them as friends? That's the way Betsy feels about the earth right now. Joyful for what it is and grief for what's happening. Yeah. Barbara.
Hi.
Hi, go ahead. Did you have something you wanted to share?
No, I just joined. Sorry.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Steve, I wonder if it'd be good for you to have a microphone because I can't see from here. And I think it'd be great if you could just be the MC for people who have their hands up or want to jump in. Well, we're about to turn, so thank you. When it comes time for plenary, that'd be great, Chris. Okay, so I'm glad you shared all of that. Let's look at some wisdom about grief and joy. Let's go to the next slide, Chris. So here we have some wisdom from scripture and from people whose names you may recognize, philosophers and leaders. And the ones on the left are about grief, and I'm going to read them first. From the Gospel of John. So you have pain now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. From the Psalms, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. C.S. Lewis wrote, "No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear." And Queen Elizabeth, grief is the price we pay for love. Does any of that resonate with you?
After my husband died, I got a cat and I was afraid to love him because I was afraid he would die too. because until he became comfortable in the street. But it was hard. I could felt when I was able to love him unconditionally.
Hmm,
It took about
When-
6 weeks.
6 weeks, okay. Anybody on Zoom, are there any of these quotes that resonate with you on the left in particular? Okay, or Elizabeth, go ahead.
The relationship between fear and grief, exactly what Betsy was talking about. And I see this reflected all the time in everybody I talk to with regard to the world and with regard to the right wing folks often who are so reactive and grabbing for something for security, because underneath is a grief and a fear that they can't touch or cope or comprehend. So they react by grabbing for something that seems secure, even though it's not really.
Thanks. And Steve, Moen?
Yeah, when Kathy died, I was a little bit embarrassed for a week or two because I had such an overarching feeling of gratitude for what she meant to my life. And then the quote you just gave from Queen Elizabeth, I didn't realize that was an earlier source. Nancy Ross used that in a sermon. And all of a sudden, everything made sense.
Hmm. Thank you.
In other words, grief had legitimacy right there with gratitude.
Yeah.
That they weren't at odds, they weren't enemies, that they were part of living, and dying is a part of living. And I think I grew tremendously in my emotional maturity when that happened. And I was also grateful to Nancy for making it so concise. That simple statement.
Thank you.
I was trying to, at the beginning, think of that relationship, right? Grief and joy, having a hard time putting them together. And then I appreciated the second slide kind of with the dichotomy. I was like, okay. But still in the back of my head, trying to like, and then I'm an adoptive mom. And one of the girls' names is Joy. And when I think back on that adoption, or when I think about that it does embody both grief and joy. Grief of how she came to be and the relief and joy of her coming to be in our family. And so in that now, I have how they live together and not dichotomous. So thanks for the exercise.
Thank you. And so let's look at some of these quotes on the right about joy. From the Psalms, clap your hands, all you peoples, shout to God with loud songs of joy. Ecclesiastes, go eat your bread with enjoyment and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has long ago approved what you do. Joy is the simplest form of gratitude, Karl Barth. And Mother Teresa, joy is prayer, joy is strength, joy is love. Joy is a net of love by which you can catch souls. Any of that resonate? And then finally, this is just one of my favorites, Yeats. Being Irish, he had an abiding sense of tragedy which sustained him through temporary periods of joy. And that could be said about my grandfather, who was one of the most loving people I have ever met. But one of his favorite expressions when everybody would get raucous, he would say, fun's fun, but you can't die laughing. Which I think is a way to just say, I'm getting uncomfortable with the runaway laughter in here. There's something about it that unsettled him. And he was a man who buried his first son at 13 and who had a lot of other grief in his life. So I've thought of that. And that has a little bit of foreboding joy to it, which we'll talk about later on as well. So it is true that joy and grief feel like opposites. Sad, happy, a loss, a gain. Grief can feel empty and joy can feel full. Grief is connected with despair and joy is connected with hope. So when we get into that dualistic mindset, they can really feel like opposites. And certainly our culture would paint them as opposites. A friend of mine told me a story about being at the reception after a funeral of a friend when she was young. So it was a young man who had died. And she was gathering with other dear friends of this man, and they got to talking about some of his characteristics and his jokes, and they started laughing. And it felt so good to laugh. And one of the elders came over and scolded them and said, "This is a serious time, you should not be laughing." And I thought about that story when I was in Houston this summer. At the end of June, I was there for 10 days. They were 10 of my father's last 12 days. And my brother and sister and I, my brother lives in London, my sister lives in Austin. We rented an Airbnb about 5 minutes away from my dad's house. And so we would spend all day with my dad and talking about all kinds of serious stuff and praying together and trying to help him be comfortable. And it was hard work and really wrenching work. And then we would send him off to bed and we would go back to the Airbnb and order tacos and talk. And invariably, we ended up laughing every night, talking about stories from our childhood or stories about my dad. And at one point, my brother said, "Is this bad luck? Is it bad luck?" And so I hold on to that as one of my lived experiences of how you can't separate grief and joy. You can feel grief all day long and go home and cuddle with your dog or laugh with someone you love, and your heart still leaps, right? So grief and joy are actually similar in ways. They're similar in their vulnerability. They are both vulnerable emotions. They both are a mirror of our exposed heart, our fragility. They show what matters to us. And they are a way, both in grief and in joy, a way of opening us up to God. So let's hold that. And it's true that our most intense and formative experiences in our lives, like the story I told about my dad's last couple of weeks, are always a tapestry of feelings. If you think about the most important times in your life and had a moment to just put yourself back in them, you might remember a pretty complicated set of experiences and emotions. And so I want us to think about the fact that let's just take it as it is. It's a given that they're all intertwined. Our life is all intertwined with these various emotions. And our Episcopal tradition is smart about that, because in the Compline prayer, one of the Compline prayers, you may remember that this is what people would pray at the end of the day. These are their last thoughts that they share with God before they go to bed. And the petition is, "Tend the sick, Lord Christ, give rest to the weary, bless the dying, soothe the suffering, pity the afflicted, shield the joyous, and all for your love's sake." Shield the joyous. So joy needs shielding too, as well as prayers for those who've been afflicted. So I think the reason this topic came to me, and it's been rattling around in my head, honestly, for the last 2.5 years, is that sense in the early pandemic of just this avalanche of grief. Grief for the loss of life, grief for the loss of the lives we thought we were going to have, grief for our helplessness, for the acknowledgement of our vulnerability and the huge vulnerability of others. It felt like a real storm of grief. And as I talked with people throughout it, and as we came through the worst parts of it, and things started to open up, I heard from people, I went out to dinner last night and I sat outside. Is it okay to have fun? I don't know if you felt any of that sense of intensity for so long that then when you take loosen your grip, that it feels strange. So I think that's the origin of this. And I started thinking about it in terms of grief and joy, but what I realized pretty quickly is that it's not just about grief and joy. That when we talk about the intertwining of important emotions, what we're really talking about is embodiment and emotion. And so I want to turn to that for just a minute. So emotions and embodiment. So why are we talking about emotions and embodiment in a church parish hall? I mean, isn't that something you talk about in your therapist's office or with your friends? And the answer is, first of all, that all of our health, our spiritual health, our physical health, our mental health, our emotional health are all tied together. And if we want to grow deeper in our spiritual lives and grow deeper in our knowledge of God and love for each other, then that means knowing ourselves emotionally and being able to see those connections in our life. We want to also, here's another reason why we're doing it together. We want to develop a common understanding of emotions, but for us, so that we can care for each other, so that in our ministries, when we reach tough times, I'm thinking about our social justice ministries and our creation care retreat last weekend, where we talked about, maybe the work of creation care is to get comfortable with the death of our species. How about that as something that really rattles you? And it's not comfortable, but if we aren't able to be grounded and know our feelings and what grief feels like, I think it'll be hard for us to minister in a way that allows us to stay present to the pain and suffering of the world and of each other. And the fact is that emotional regulation, the ability to feel your emotions, to know what they are, to be comfortable with the uncomfortable feelings and ride through it, making choices about how you want to behave, is absolutely essential for conversations about social justice. Think about the statement of lament and action. There's a lot of heavy stuff in there. And as Emily and I found out at the Inquirer's class on Sunday, it can really bring up some hurt places for people. And the fact is, we're meant to feel strong feelings when we see other people suffering, right? We're not meant to have no reaction at all. But to know, it's compassion, right? When you encounter the distress of another and you start to share in that. But if we don't know how to feel that and what to do with that, then it's easy to say, particularly if it's not our suffering, I just can't think about this anymore. I can't, it's too much for me. I'm tired of thinking about folks who are struggling with racism or poverty or income inequality. And that's okay. But the more we develop our strength and understanding our own emotions, the more we're going to be able to show up and stay in tough conversations. So I think we need a theology of emotion, God talk about emotion. And that's what we're going to do. So we're going to start tonight by talking about emotions and embodiment and what that means. And there's going to be some thinking about grief and joy. And then next week, we're going to focus on grief and joy and how by the time this is over, because I'm pretty convinced, when we add grief and joy together, we say something about God. And we say something about resurrection, and we say something about hope. And so that's where we're headed. But this week, I want to start us out by talking about emotions and embodiment. So Chris, let's go to the next slide. So I'm relying on this next part a lot on Hilary McBride's book, The Wisdom of Your Body. She is a psychotherapist. She was one of the participants in the Liturgist podcast. She's based in Vancouver. And she is coming next year to speak at St. Mark's next May, Saturday, May 6th. She's going to be having a workshop between 9:30 and 3 on embodiment. And so this is, I suppose, a little plug for that, because I really do think she has a lot to teach us, and also some pre-thinking. So what does our culture have to say about feelings?
I grew up in a household where I was very emotional. And my father informed me that if I didn't have my emotions all worked out by the time I was 25, I was emotionally retarded.
Okay,
I needed to be pretty flat.
okay. That's what culture can say. Yeah. So culture, Betsy's right. Our culture is widely feeling phobic. Feelings are threatening. They are unproductive. And at the very least, feeling illiterate. I know I feel bad. I know I just hit you, but I really can't tell you why that happened. Mandy?
I think our culture wants them to be place specific, certain feelings in certain spaces.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
Yeah, right. Some feelings are appropriate in some places and not others, particular feelings, right? And it's viewed negatively to give into your emotions. And sometimes it's because it will upset the group dynamic. We perceive it will be, or we were taught that it would, or that we're worried about what other people will think of us if we are emotive in some way. But the fact is that emotions, we have them because they are essential to our survival and our thriving. They are, each of them has a purpose and gives us a way to adapt to what happens in life. And here's something interesting. Emotions actually influence our self-understanding more than thinking does. So we can think all day long about something, but if we feel differently, our core self is going to believe what the feelings tell us. And so my spiritual director would say, that's why we allow all the voices to speak in discernment. You cannot argue the fearful self into not being afraid. And one of the interesting facts is that mental structures that process emotions are located deeper in the brain than thinking structures, or earlier, and they influence our decision-making. So there are 7 categories of emotion, at least that Hilary McBride names, and so I'm not saying this as if I know all the science, but this is what they name, and I think they're helpful ones. So Chris, let's go to the next page. Oh wait, no, let's stay here. Let's do that. Yeah, don't go. Anger, sadness, or grief, disgust, joy, or happiness, fear, excitement, and desire. And that desire could be sexual desire, or it could be other desire that is a powerful force for decision-making. So let's roll the clip. It's coming. There we go.
So, Riley, how was the first day of school?
Fine, I guess.
Did you guys pick up on that?
Sure did.
Something's wrong.
Signal the husband.
Uh-oh, she's looking at us. What did she say?
Oh, sorry, sir. No one was listening.
Is it garbage night? We left the toilet seat up. What is it, woman? What?
I'm joy. This is sadness. That's anger.
What?
This is disgust. And that's fear. We're Riley's emotions. These are Riley's memories. They're mostly happy, you'll notice, not to brag.
I wanted to maybe hold one.
What happened? Sadness?
She did something to the memory.
Is everything okay?
I don't know.
Take it back, Joy.
Trying.
Joy, no,
Let
wait.
go.
The core memories. Can I say that curse word now?
Okay, that's good.
What do we do now?
Nothing's working. Why isn't it working?
We have a major problem.
Oh, I wish.
There you go. So this just happens to be one of my favorite movies. I don't know if you all have seen it. It's Inside Out. And it is very wise and brilliant, yes, in terms of naming these different emotions that live inside a certain person, and the emotions argue with each other. They hijack the controls at times. When she's young, they all seem to exist separately, but as she gets older, she realizes that joy and sadness, the same memory, can be tinged with both joy and sadness. And so that's a reality. And if you ever need a great movie, watch that. So let's go on and we'll talk about each of these 7 emotions. And you saw 4 of them there, right? You saw joy and anger, the red and disgust. So there are 7 emotions that we're talking about, and each of them is essential to our survival, and each of them has some trash talk from our culture. So anger gives us the strength to fight, the strength to defend ourselves and to change things, but it's seen as dangerous, violent, and unfeminine. Sadness is meant to signal the need for support and connection. It is meant as a way of connecting, and that expression is essential for healing. But many of us have been taught that it's weak to be sad or embarrassing. Joy helps us, it expands us, it can heal us, it helps us to thrive. But in its exuberance, it can be seen as selfish or irresponsible or inviting bad luck. Fun's fun, but you can't die laughing, right? Fear puts us on alert to protect ourselves or to protect those we love, but it's also can be seen as weak or unreliable if you're fearful. Excitement, it allows us to explore and take risk, but it can feel overwhelming to other people. Don't get so excited, you need to be more serious. You need to think more about the wrong things that could happen. And then disgust is something that originated in our bodies to tell us that something was harmful for us to eat. And, but it can also be seen as a threatening or a judging thing. And then finally, desire. It helps us to meet our needs. It gives us pleasure. But our society has done, or culture has done a good job of making it dirty or somehow the opposite of holiness. So 7 categories of emotions, and we're going to talk about the embodiment of these emotions. But first, we're going to break into small groups. Let's go to the next slide. And the question is, what did you learn about emotions growing up? And were some emotions more acceptable than others? And keep yourself safe in this conversation. If this stirs up something for you, you can pass. You can decide to say very little and then set stuff aside. I know, this can touch some memories. So we are going to be in small groups now for 10 minutes. And Steve is going to put those of you on Zoom into groups, I think of 3 or 4. And because I think that'll give everybody a chance to talk. Or 5. Do you want to come join this group here? Or you guys want to get together? Yeah. Okay. What did you learn about emotions growing up, and are some more acceptable than others? Conversations, and we're going to come back together. And it looks like our Zoom participants are back here. So let's take 5 minutes or so. And were there any themes or commonalities that came up? We'll go in the room first and then we'll turn to Zoom. Any themes or anything that you noticed in the stories of others?
Just how much I value them. I'm sitting here thinking, oh, wow, I worship with these people all the time and I know some of them, but I don't know these basic things and they may have told me before. I'm sorry, but it's just so lovely to hear more of the core.
One thing that a few of us talked about was just the anxiety as a kid of negative emotions or what the parents were going through. So there'd be, if there was a mother or a father who had strong emotions, that would be something that would be very scary growing up. And also how positive emotions were pretty, for many of us, they were the only ones that were super acceptable.
So you could be positive. Yeah. I remember I did most of my growing up in Houston, and it was very acceptable in that time for men to say to young women, you're so much prettier when you smile. And why aren't you smiling? And I remember walking down my high school hallway, always with a smile on my face, because that was what was expected if you wanted to be a leader. Nutty. Anything else? What else did you guys hear?
All of us felt that we were suppressed as children about expressing most emotion, especially anger, desire in particular.
Anger and desire. Yeah. Betsy?
Sorry.
Got the mic.
No, I'm ready to.
Okay. There you go.
The joy and the happiness that was acceptable, right? But what I also found out in this group, there was some similarities in the way two of us were raised, and then joy was acceptable, nothing else.
Joy was acceptable and nothing else.
Sadness or anything else, not so good. But then there was someone else in our group that was like, no, we could just express anything. So there was diversity even, from one maybe location in the United States to another, or family, or who knows, but there was similarities and differences.
Thank you. Anybody on Zoom like to share any reflection on what you heard in your group? Any themes? Yes, Elizabeth.
Well, we had several themes of positive emotions being okay, like what a lot of the other folks have said. But a couple of us were raised in the South. I grew up in Dallas, not Houston. And I was saying that my dad was this big macho guy and loved John Wayne. And of course, men don't cry. But because I was a girl, and my mother was this wilting Southern belle, it's like I was expected to have all of these feelings all the time and was not suppressed in that way. And I think that's very interesting. And also that the context was very specific. Like if you were a boy, you could get angry if the umpire made a bad call. That was okay. A lot of it around sports. You could have all kinds of, you could cry if you lost a game, or, that sort of thing. But in other parts of life, those very vulnerable feelings weren't okay, especially if you were a boy.
Thank you. Carolyn, was there something you wanted to say?
Yes. I first of all, I really love talking with people in my group. And there were some similarities. I shared scary stuff about my growing up because my father would get really, really angry. And my mother would have to kind of protect herself. But we also talked about being able to express joy and being able to express or not to express doubts about things. I don't know, maybe somebody else in my group wants to comment on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think our group, at least half of our group had a Midwestern Lutheran background, which meant emotions were things to be put in a box with a tight lock on it and only brought out in the most extreme of conditions, like last days or something. And it, you know, it's so restrictive when you think of the opportunities we have as human beings to express ourselves. But and I think one common pattern is often is that those of us who grew up where our parents went through the Depression, everything was always on the line. Everything was always serious. Businesses were losing, and the country had a lack of confidence in the future. And anybody who survived that was always very, very careful and restricted in expressing emotion and joy.
Thank you, Steve.
I have to say that sounds so much like my family, that kind of restriction, and just being restrained. And my family did go through the Depression. They were farmers through the Depression. And they knew very well that, you know, you screw up or you have a bad year and it's serious. So yeah, I feel that too. And I have, and I think the other members of our group, we've got kind of a spectrum of how open we are and how much we've been felt about free to express emotion.
Right. And some of what you're pointing to is that sense again of foreboding joy, which means when we feel joy, there sometimes is a voice that says, you know, things could really go wrong. You know, don't get too excited. You know, today may have been a good day, but tomorrow could really stink. And, you know, you may be feeling better now, but, you know, there could be something really horrible going on. And some of it is, some of us are taught that we really need to rehearse tragedy, that we need to consider all the things that could go wrong, so that we know what to do when they happen, when we get that horrible phone call. But the fact is, you can't rehearse grief. You can't rehearse those moments. And to allow oneself to fully experience the joy or the gladness, the gratitude, does not make it any more likely that you're going to get bad news than if you refuse to feel it. And I think that is some of what that Depression era gave us. Yeah, sure. One other comment. Okay. Hey, Libby.
Oh, yeah, I am. I was born in the Boot Heel of Missouri, in a very small town that was absolutely segregated, and Black people were picking cotton in the field behind my house, and their children were my playmates, and that's who my gang was. I ran with those guys, and then the civil rights movement was heating up in 56 and 57, and my parents decided to move to Eugene, Oregon. And that was a clear demarcation in my life. And so much flows from that.
Yeah. Thank you. As we think about what emotions are acceptable and what are not, I'd like to remind us that the Psalms, our sacred scripture, has every single emotion, and all of them are shared with God. So if we take that as a sign of what is acceptable, if the fullness of our emotionality is acceptable and desired by God to hear, who are we to say to each other that we can judge one as better than another? So let's go on to some more conversation about embodiment and emotions. So emotions are not, yeah, that's right. Emotions are not things we think, right? Emotions are things that happen in the body. They are embodied. They are felt in the body. They are expressed through the body. And they are essentially energy in motion throughout our body. Fear moves through our body. Excitement moves through our body. We don't think excitement, right? We may think about excitement. We may talk about excitement, but our mind did not make it happen. So emotions are embodied. And our ability to acknowledge that emotions are embodied, that they move through the body, is essential for healing. And that's hard for us because psychology and enlightenment focuses so much on cognition, on what we think and how we behave. Psychology focuses on what we say about things and how we behave. That if you don't talk about what's underlying that, which is the emotions you are experiencing, how they are in your body, then they get stuck. And so because emotions are the central driver of why we are the way we are, and they are a central driver to how we heal, that the idea of can we be with what it is we are feeling in our bodies? This we heal we heal when we can be with what we feel. So that's just a proposition. Yes.
I just want to relate that I had several times in my childhood and young adulthood when I left my body because it was impossible to be present to what was actually happening.
You left it. Yeah.
On the ceiling.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and we're going to talk about that. It's what Betsy was saying is the feelings can get so intense that we pull away, dissociate, or somehow shut down. And why would we do that, right? Well, because as we all just said, we've been taught to feel that those emotions are not okay. And when we are shamed or rejected or punished for having feelings that are not acceptable, then we suppress them. And when we suppress them in order to be able to have connections and relationships, in order to get the love we need, then what we learn is that vulnerability is hard to bear. And it can be excruciatingly unbearable to feel the vulnerability of grief or joy. And so we don't know what to do. We don't know how to soothe ourselves. We don't know how to get on the other side. And what that leads to is then what Betsy was saying, which is a sense of being cut off from our body. And that cutoff can happen through leaving it, not being aware. We live entirely in our heads. We're not aware what's happening in our body until our body has to scream at us with a backache or a headache or something to say, there's something going on, trying to tell you what it is. And Brene Brown talks about vulnerability armor. And and the things that we do in order to armor ourselves against feeling, against vulnerability. And numbing is one, whether it's with alcohol or food or TV or social media, that sense of numbing so that our minds can't listen to what our body is saying. We talked about foreboding joy, where we try to hold joy at bay because it's too hard to realize how tender our hearts are and how delighted they can be. And then perfectionism is another way to keep ourselves protected from being vulnerable, because if there's always something else that we should do to make ourselves better or to meet others' expectations, then we can be angry at ourselves for the feelings, right? If I had just taken better care of my dad, I would not be feeling grief. I was a neglectful daughter. Or fear. I didn't prepare well enough for this, and so it's right that I should feel nervous, right? I'm a perfectionist. I could go on all day, you know? It's turning on the self as a way to avoid feeling the feelings. So the thing is, though, as Walter said, you are the plant. Emotions are a wave. Emotions rise and emotions fall. When they rise, they feel like they are going to be here forever and they are going to take us down into the deep. But if we can body surf our way through them, just trying to pay attention, yes. The weather. Emotions are like the weather.
You can see above the clouds, you can see clear sky, but emotions being the weather. When we're down on the ground, some days we have storms, some days we have clear skies, some days we have drought, some days we have plentiful rain, and it will pass. And we must be and accept and love ourselves in the process.
Yes, they will pass. I guess one of the things I wanted to say before that, so we're going to back up a little bit, is this sense of what happens when we don't allow ourselves to feel the emotions, when we do the numbing or suppress them. And Hilary McBride and Basil Vandercook and many have talked about how the body keeps the score. That if there is an emotion or an experience that is not fully lived, embodied, so that we can feel it and then acknowledge it, that we have an infinite capacity to store memories and feelings that by ignoring them do not go away. And my own personal experience with this was in 1995, I got pregnant for the first time and I lost the baby at about 14 weeks. And I was in New York, I was a perfectionist banker, and everybody was saying, just move on, it's all gonna be okay. You'll get pregnant again, and I did after about 6 months. And my son was born, and then we moved to Amsterdam. And while I was there, in the early months, we went on some corporate retreat for my husband's business. And a lot of the ways that the Dutch people
Oh, we don't want to miss her. Jennifer, you're on mute.
Jennifer, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
We can't hear you.
Okay.
Crisis.
crisis.
Try now. Yeah.
Yeah, we missed the whole story. You were on.
Okay, I'll back up.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. I'll back up.
You were in Amsterdam.
The story is about how our emotions, did you hear me talk about Basil Vandercook at all?
Yeah.
Okay, so the idea is that the body keeps the score, right? That if we don't feel things, we have places that we put them. And the story is that I had a miscarriage in New York in 1995 before my first child was born. And I lived through that in the way that a perfectionist does, who's never had kids, who had not told a lot of people that she was pregnant. And it was something that wasn't discussed. And we moved on. And I moved to the Netherlands. And the first time with our son, who was born after that, and the first time that I had a massage, there was a place in the middle of my lower back that when she massaged me, I was miscarrying again. I could feel it. It was in my head, it was in my body, it was in my heart, and I just sobbed. And I was completely overwhelmed. I had no idea. And we talked about it, and I thought, well, that was interesting. I went again 3 months later, and the same thing happened. And I said to her, this is no fun if this is going to be, what happens every time I come. And it was clear that I had to do some work about grieving. And it doesn't happen anymore. But it's real. It's real. If we have grief, if we have fear that we don't allow ourselves to feel, we're not helping. We're just kicking the can down the road. And then it gets all not so much fun. So the body keeps the score. The truth is that emotions rise and they eventually fall, and that emotions are a doorway to our inner life. They give us a sense of what's happening in our inner life, and they teach us about what matters to us, and about what worries us, and about what we need to share with others. That what we cannot go through on our own, what we have to be willing to be vulnerable about. So emotions are our teachers. One of the quotes I really like from Diana Fascia is that feelings are the experiential arc between the problem and the solution. And so if you have a problem and you aren't willing to feel anything about it, you will never get to the solution. So we care about this in community for all the reasons we said at the beginning. We care about each other's holistic health. We care about our ability to walk with each other and be with each other. And that means not only saying it's okay for you, Emily, to tell me everything that's going on with you, but if I am not willing to share, and each of us is not willing, then it's not the kind of relationship that makes a person feel safe to be vulnerable. So you've probably heard about emotional regulation. We talked about that at the beginning. The idea that our ability to go into hard places, to have conversations, is absolutely connected to emotional regulation. Our ability to know what we're feeling, to sit with it and watch it rise and watch it fall, and then see what we're going to do with it. And I'm not saying that grief is a one-time experience. I'm saying that there are waves of grief, and that a wave of grief will come and go, and it may be followed just like labor pains with another one slamming right into you. But it comes in waves. And so our ability to feel deeply any of those 7 emotions means showing up for all of them. So Hillary McBride names, the next slide, how we let our emotions teach us. And these are some practices when you experience a strong emotion: anger, sadness. I don't know about you, but do you ever get this feeling of sadness and you don't know why? So the way I was taught is if you ignore it long enough, you'll start to think about something happy, But it's so much more instructive. And when parenting taught me this, that I have to actually be able to ask myself, what are you sad about? And then I actually had more insight into what was happening in my children's life and in my own life. So the first practice is that when an emotion emerges, when you feel that, why am I sad, or anger or whatever, to direct your attention to what's happening in your body. Where do you feel it? Is it in your stomach? Is it in your shoulders? Is your head hurting? Your jaw clenched? Are you clenching your hands? Where are you feeling it? And then this is the tricky part, I think, is try to not think about what it is, but just notice. And then think about the emotion as a wave. If this is a wave that I'm experiencing in my body, what kind of a wave is it? Is it building? Is it just sort of a steadiness, but it's still lapping at me? Is it just crashed over me and I feel like I'm, been pounded back into the surf? What kind of a wave is it? And then watch what your thoughts are doing. Is your mind trying to talk you out of spending any time here? Is your mind reminding you of your grocery list, or the fact that you really don't have time for this because you got an email to answer or a Zoom call? Notice what your mind does when you are willing to sit and feel that emotion. Are they throwing fuel on the fire? Are they telling you things that make the wave feel bigger? That's what a perfectionist would do, right? So the idea is to step back and try to only sense the emotion and tell your mind to put the snooze button on. And then talk to yourself compassionately. Be compassionate with yourself. So if a perfectionist might criticize herself for feeling grief, if you'd only done these things differently, you wouldn't be feeling grief. The compassionate one would say, this is really hard. I am so sorry. And it may sound silly to you, but it really does help to say actively to oneself, this really hurts. I'm really sorry. It should hurt. You loved very deeply. And offer that compassion or anger. How can you be compassionate with yourself when you're angry? Except to say, I see your anger. You know, this is helping you survive something. So we're just gonna let you be angry. I'm not gonna let you send that email, but we're gonna let you be angry. And we're gonna let the whole wave of anger pass. And then as the wave goes through you, be curious. What did I learn about myself? What did I learn about the tapes that are running in my head whenever I feel sad or get excited or hopeful about something? It's all the conditioning that we received that you all talked about too. What are the voices that are evoked by this emotion? And what happens is, as we get more accustomed to this and are willing to experience emotions embodied and to be taught by them, is that they don't frighten us as much. And they become, the waves may still get really choppy at times, but we don't feel overwhelmed. It's more that feeling of, being grounded and trusting that the storm will pass. So we're going to go into small groups one more time. And here are our questions for each other. And maybe you want to take a couple of minutes just to think, because this may take a little bit of centering. How do you experience grief in your body? Does your stomach hurt? How do you experience grief in your body? How do you experience joy in your body? And is there any way that's changed from childhood to adulthood? And I guess what I would suggest is let's it's 7:57. Steve, let's just breathe for a minute and let people think about these questions, and then we'll go into our small groups, okay? So I'll keep track of the breathing time, and then we'll go into groups for 10 minutes. Okay, it looks like we're coming back together. And I don't know what the tone was on Zoom, but I noticed that the volume of conversation in here was much quieter this time around. There are fewer people, but I think it's hard to talk in loud voices about how our bodies feel grief or joy. So I wonder, would anyone like to share any commonalities or learnings that you had in your conversation?
I wanted her to do it, so. Well, we're from, the three of us reflect the fact that we're more aware of our emotions and more aware of the comings ups and down and the joy and the grief. So has it changed over time? Yes, life is much better. But we still have different responses to grief. I think our story about joy was somewhat similar, but for those two, it's much more in their body. And for me, I'm not sure where it is. But.
Yeah, it can take us a lifetime to get acquainted with how we feel emotions. So it's a slow and steady race, not even a race, a walk. Anybody else in the room would like to share anything? Anybody online?
I'll take it. Let me see. Well, this is Steve. I was taught professionally to disparage things like muscle memory and the kind of things you were talking about, because they didn't rise to the level of recognized scientific verification. And actually, I was involved in a lot of cases involving repressed memory where it was in litigation and it was very serious challenging of things like that. But you make a very compelling description based upon people's real experiences that these things are real. And as I've gone through some emotional things in my own life in my later years, I have to think, well, if we all end up as dust, of course there has to be something more complex than what's in our brain. And some simplistic idea that you can analyze and do a chart and define everything based upon a figure that you draw in 1910 or 1940 or 1980 that explains everything. That's really arrogant. And you look back at the Psalms and all these things of 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, they had a pretty good understanding of a lot of things. They might not be able to draw a chart as well as the scientific community might today, but they had a pretty good understanding of emotional intelligence and emotional being that maybe we ought to listen to.
Thank you. Yes, the wisdom of the body is not a new revelation in the world. It's potentially a new revelation in the last couple of generations among Western practitioners, but not among Eastern practitioners or even some Western. But that is the way of knowledge, I think. It's we've privileged our minds for a couple of centuries, and now we're returning back to a more complex and grounded sense of wisdom. Any last comment? It looks like Carolyn, you have something you want to say?
I do. We had a great discussion, but I realized something, which is I experienced grief like very much in my heart, and then I just close, almost like, I don't know, a fetal position, something like that. But it was very interesting to me when I thought about joy. When I feel joy, I want to hug, I want to dance. I have a bodily desire to share my joy. I don't want to feel joy by myself.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yes, and that same vulnerability, we'll talk next week. We're not meant to feel grief by ourselves either. But sometimes we think we should. So let's wrap up. I have homework for next week. And even though you didn't register, Steve wrote down all of your names. And so I am going to send you an email to remind you. And the homework is this. When you feel an emotion, or you find yourself thinking about the fact that you might be having an emotion, practice what it's like to just give yourself a second to attend to that emotion. Where do you feel it in your body? What kind of a wave is it? What is your mind saying to you? Can you be compassionate and curious? Okay, that's the homework. And then next week, we will talk about this friendship of grief and joy, how they travel together, what happens when they love each other, and how that connects with resurrection and hope in our troubled world. Any last thoughts before we pray? God be with you. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous. And all for your love's sake. Amen.
Amen.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.